Hey, Mike, welcome to another 401 Access Denied podcast. Where, this is really a fun discussion, and I'm really enjoying, a lot of the information we're sharing. And this time, we're going to be looking at the recently released Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report. It's definitely, for me as a researcher and doing a lot of, kind of reading of reports throughout the year, it's definitely one that I really get excited about because it's very thoroughly, researched. It's good details. It provides you good kind of, let's say, thermometer, kind of good indication or trend of what's really happening in the industry. And in most cases, that when you're reading it, I think it's the 13th year now that this report is being released. And, it's on everyone's calendar. We're usually waiting between the April and May timeframes. Right. Everyone's, sitting around, with their cups of coffee ready. And when the report comes out, spending, and then you get a lot of people like myself writing blogs and, and analyzing it and interpreting it. Mm-hmm. But one thing that I find is that, every time, over the last many years I've been reading this and reporting on it and sharing my thoughts, is you're always in this, this face and your pan moment where you're just like, oh, or it's doom and gloom, and it's always about, it's how bad we're getting, right, and all the thing, everything we've been investing in security and the technologies and the hard work that goes through, and it's like you're always saying the doom and gloom that it's getting worse. More people are clicking on crap. More people are clicking on malware. Malware is increasing. Incidents are increasing. Breaches are happening time and time again. And this report, I was so happy this year. I don't know if you got to go through it in as much detail, but for me, I think this report indicates that finally we're starting to see results.
Yeah.
That finally,
No, I was just going to say, no, I rely on people like you to sort of give me the synopsis rather than dig through all of the details of the report. I look forward to everybody else's takes on it, and I can sort of pull that together and take in more of a summarized view than pouring through all the details. So I appreciate your hard work in going through and doing that work for me.
You're definitely the smart one of doing this. Because, going and reading other people's interpretations is probably the easiest thing.
Yes.
And it's definitely the smartest and quickest, and you get a lot of different views and viewpoints. For me, I like to compare it with my research that I do and compare notes. Right. And also a lot of peers of mine also contribute to the report as well, which is always interesting to see their feedback and results too. But absolutely, you're right. Sometimes read my report, read my blog, which
I'll give you a plug rather.
A quick summary.
Go read Joe's synopsis. It's awesome.
Yeah. So, but this time, I mean, what I really for me, it was actually, I was actually sitting up. I was like, whoa, this is positive. Malware's decreasing. People are clicking in less rubbish. Things are improving. There's been less data breaches. It was one of those moments in time where I started getting my hand and I started trying to pat myself in the back. And I think all security professionals around the world, this is a report to show that their hard work is actually paying off. Cybersecurity awareness training, getting security culture into the employees and all the messages and all the hard things, and sleepless nights and research around the clock. And a lot of, also in it as well was an indicator that a lot of security researchers, we always talk about, hackers being used in the bad terms. Mm-hmm. And I always disagree with that because I see myself as a hacker and I'm ethical. And sometimes the news and media make us out to be the bad, the villains. Mm-hmm. And also even security researchers, that do responsible disclosure sometimes get also turned out to be villains because, they're sharing with the world these vulnerabilities, and organizations sometimes basically will, victimize them or even try to sue them, for the work and for making people aware that they have insecure products. So I think for me, this report was a highlight that actually, security researchers, most organizations will find out about breaches from security researchers. Which was a great indicator that, there's a collaboration between companies and security researchers happening, and that security researchers are your friends and really working with you to make the world a safer place. So, and those are security researchers, they are hackers. They are basically fundamental. That's what their primary focus is on. So the report was great. It might, as it says, it might not be a champagne moment. It's not time to break out the bubbly and say we've won and great. And
I don't think there's ever winning. It's just doing better.
There's never winning. It's just about it's about surviving in many cases. Right. Do you pull out the champagne just to show that we survived? But I think, it's definitely a moment, security researchers and hackers around the world who do, spend the time in working for good, focus and helping organizations. This is a moment to visit, celebrate. This is a moment.
I agree. I mean, we really do we have a responsible disclosure program that we, there's a link to it right from our site. We sort of rely on it. We have, our community is filled with security researchers. We want to take advantage of that. And in fact, when filling out, those annoying security questionnaires for various companies, they ask, like, what do you do from a security perspective? It's one of the first things I list is we have this program. It's actually turned up more things than, some of the audits we've done, I really appreciate it. I don't, it never occurred to me like this is somehow like how could this be a negative thing to get this information about my platform and what we're doing and the vulnerabilities in it from someone who clearly cares and is going, sort of a partner. And it's crowdsourced. It's going to be similar to spreading out the number of attacks and how all the different people who could be attacking your system. Now you're using that crowd to test your system and give you that feedback. I super appreciate that program that we have.
I completely agree. I mean, this is a community. This is a community effort. This is working together, and bringing experts in various different views and specializations to really help. And that was one of the important things here. One of the things the report did say is that if you do, become a victim, that you're more likely to hear from third parties, your customers, partners, and security researchers. We're actually the top third party, basically individuals or people or teams or companies that will inform you of those. So the report itself, not a champagne moment, not time to break out the bubbly, but definitely time to celebrate. Definitely time to bring out the barbecue. Maybe have a couple of good, beers and whatever your preference of drink it may be. For some people, it might be water. In Estonia here, definitely vodka is the common tabletop drink. But it definitely, it's a time to reflect and looking at security professionals, like yourself and me and others that we work with and their peers, to really say, thank you for the work that they've done. To really reduce the threats and make the world safer. Because this is a report to indicate that the world is a little bit safer this year, maybe from computer viruses and ransomware, but not other types of viruses that we can't deal with. But definitely an indication that the resident improvements has been made.
I agree, and I think there's a couple underlying causes that might be moving us forward in that way. I think those responsible disclosure programs, there's a few of them out there. They're more collaborative. I think that they're sort of picking up in speed, which means, for us, one of the vulnerabilities that was pointed out to us was actually in a third party SaaS that we use. And so sure enough, like I took this person's report and passed it on to them so they could sort of fix it. We patched it and we came up with a solution, but it was really their problem. And so I think that sort of sharing of information and making that so easy to do, it turned out that this provider was also on the exact same platform we were on for the disclosure program. So it made it really easy to sort of submit it to them as well. And so I think that collaboration is really helping. And I look at, security awareness is good, but like, I think really pushing it out more beyond just the typical awareness stuff of what links to click on. And it's really about enabling your entire staff to really think about security and the implications. And I think we're doing a much better job of sort of security enablement. It's that's one of the Cybrary ideas that we push a lot on is, everybody in an organization that can touch technology has to understand the implications of their actions, because you can really affect the security posture of your whole company, even if you're, in sales or in marketing or whatever, because you're using this platform and you have the ability to do a thing. So I think we're doing a much better job of getting everybody involved, and it's not these siloed, like this is the security team within the company. I think we're doing a much better job.
Yeah, security is becoming a cross-departmental function. It's no longer just, you still have those who are responsible for technology, but it's becoming much more across the departments,
It's like health and safety. I think it's that same sort of shared responsibility. We don't see it it's, I'm not going to clean up every mess I see, but I'm also, if I make a mess, it's my responsibility to clean it up so that somebody doesn't, slip and fall.
Absolutely. It's risk reduction. It's a,
Right,
yeah, you're right.
exactly.
It's a health and safety across, and that's how it should be viewed. It's not, IT's problem all the time, or it's
Right.
not this other, person's, responsibility. Is that people are now starting to see that we are together. I have a shared responsibility to do the right thing. And you're right. It's about empowering employees to be basically better, secure, better culture. I think that's definitely one thing that is probably reduced on the click rate on malicious links as well. So that's definitely positive. Is that people are becoming much more aware and better at actually being able to identify as well and report.
Right.
So there's technology is definitely helping as well. But I think another important area is that companies are starting to take security more seriously. I also do think that regulation and compliance is helping force the boards and organizations to really take security more seriously. And seeing companies, having a CISO report to the board as well, not just into the executive staff, but into the board, actually shows that now they're starting to get a voice. They're starting to get much more, I think they're getting ears and people listening. Some or may not be getting as much action or support out of it, but they're definitely getting a voice on the table.
And I think one of the things that's driving that, though, I mean, in addition to taking it more seriously, like, why do you take it more seriously? I think part of it is the financial implications of a breach and the cost in cleaning up, the cost to reputation, the cost, all these various costs are just building up. And so in the past, it might not have been as big of a deal, but now you're seeing larger fines, you're seeing all sorts of financial implications. I mean, I think it's what's lacking in the IoT world to drive those companies to make more secure IoT devices, and we can save that for a different day. But that same stuff is what is driving, I think, the CISO reporting into the board and it being seen, as a much more important function of the company, because it does directly, you can draw a line to the bottom line. It directly impacts the company.
I agree. One of the things, I mentioned it before with you that, when I reported to me and the CISO reported to the board to try and get budget, and the board came back and says, "Oh, you're talking basically cost, fear."
Right.
And the interesting thing was, going back to that point, is that it's the cost of doing nothing versus the cost of doing something. And if that cost of doing nothing is a big cost,
right,
the board will listen about how are we going to reduce this? How are we going to offset that? And what I really think as well is that, companies are now investing more. They're investing more in a balanced approach, not just saying, I remember somebody who was at one of the peers at a conference years ago, turned around and said, when they took a position into being like the cyber awareness, strategy person in the company about rolling out security. And the executive team said to her, "You go and solve all this cybersecurity stuff." It's like going to boil the ocean. It's like,
exactly,
solve it all. You've got our support, but you've got zero budget. So go.
Right, exactly. Right. You've got right. Go solve this, but we can't give you any money and we can't give you any people. Good luck with that.
Yeah. Yeah. So, but I think that is changing over time. And I think, more people are saying that you do have to invest in it. And it's a balanced approach. It's not just a technology, it's about balance between, skilled people in the organization, good technology, and having those work together definitely helps reduce and helps, ultimately what we're seeing here from the Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report 2020 is the results of those efforts. Yeah. And we can't be complacent as well. We can't just turn around and say, right, enough is enough. We have to keep pushing. We have to keep, making sure that CISOs are getting the resources and budget that they need, that security professionals are getting the support in order to help actually, invest in the right areas to roll out the right technologies. One of the things that was interesting in the report as well was that we're starting to see a lot more, where the balance, I think it was around 23% of the cloud was targeted and around 70% of on-premise areas as well. So there is basically, but out of the cloud, that 23% or so of cloud instance, that actually around 70% of those was actually from brute force, stolen credentials attempted. So that shows, that the difference is that where it's on-premise, where they're trying, criminals are trying to take a much more maybe vulnerabilities or, unpatched systems or exploits or, phishing scams. Right. So those techniques that are being used directly at the on-premise perimeter, which is kind of still traditional, to the cloud side seems to be much more of an access control issue. And this means that, yes, if you're an organization and you're looking at cloud, then you got to make sure a password and username is the only thing that's protecting it.
Right.
And this got to a point where I started thinking as I'm reading through the report, is we really need to consider about, should we allow humans to create passwords? Should we start thinking that humans, we're not very good at creating unique long passwords.
Right.
And this means that we really need, from a cloud perspective, that we really need to consider, around better access controls, better authorization controls and authentication mechanisms, rather than just having a password being the control there. So
yeah, and I think the other thing
that
when it comes to cloud that I think I see or pay the most attention to is those unsecured environments where the developers are like, hey, we just need an environment to do a thing. It's a test environment, so maybe it's not as rigorous in terms of who should have access and who shouldn't. Next thing you know, you've sort of overprivileged a dev. They don't understand the implication of what they did, and next thing you know, you have your some cluster that's maybe it's an Elasticsearch cluster that's now open to the public, and it has a bunch of data. Maybe it has sample data. Maybe it's not your full database, but it still has some copy of production or whatever. Those are the things that always worry me. And I think how do you come up with the right controls when you're talking about cloud that you allow that group, that development group, to do the innovation they need to do. Give them you don't want to get in their way. You want to be able to say yes. You don't want to be the guy who always says no. But at the same time, how do you do it in a way that protects your users, your company, your reputation, and making that as seamless as possible as well.
Yeah, and to your point, one of the things that was interesting in the report itself was that as a lot of things were declining, such as malware and phishing attempts and other types of techniques, the one thing that was on the increase was misconfigurations and errors.
Exactly.
And it's to your point, is that one of the biggest problems is self-inflicted incidents, self-inflicted data breaches, where people are putting databases open to the public by misconfiguring them. And I think this is the point where many organizations expect us to run fast, but sometimes you do have to take those moments of you're doing it fast, but you want to take a moment to sit back and think, but am I doing it secure by design? Am I doing it by privacy? Am I putting the right security controls in place? So we do have to make sure, as we're running fast, it's more like a relay, or you take phases that we have to stop, reflect, make sure we've done the right thing, and make sure we haven't configured something incorrectly. So yeah, errors was the biggest thing, was on the increase. So those are areas, and it might, to your point, that organizations might be trial and erroring. They're doing their digital transformation. They might not be bringing the right people in. They might be learning as they're doing, and they might be doing bad practices, which ends up not putting security in place. So that's an interesting kind of thing that we need to think about.
And I think also when you're doing those cloud transformations, and I just had this discussion with a couple of people the other day, which is we're taking these systems that were designed for that on-prem. You have the servers, you have this, you have that. Cloud is a completely different thing. It's just so different that my recommendation in general is to go and find someone who's gone through it to help guide you through that process of how do you take this system and transform it, or how do you start, maybe it's not even transforming what you already have. Maybe it's like, we're going to start down the road with new projects. We're not going to try and take legacy systems and put it on the cloud, but we're going to start this new thing. But again, you still need that educational piece of this is a different world, and these are the implications. I think about with the cloud, how easy is it to spin up what used to be a data center that would cost me millions of dollars and take, months to build. I can now spin it up with I can write a config file and spin it up in minutes. And so I think there's a lot that goes into the sort of cloud architecture and security, and, saying, I don't know, and reaching out for help and looking for companies to partner with or consultants is, I think, the best approach to not make those mistakes and not go through the trial and error.
Yeah, and your point, I've got a great metaphor for the comparison.
Okay, please.
So so the short, so I had a long discussion about this. We went into depth with a journalist like months ago on this, and it was the difference between on-premise and cloud. And even getting into SaaS and other types of differences, and the things that you need to think differently is the security approaches are very different. So you think about on-premise, it's just like your car garage. You park your car is that system. You might have a bicycle, you might have a motorbike, you've got different things in your garage. And those basically, when they're in there, and that garage door is protecting the access. That's the one door, and it's only door. You might have another side entrance door,
Right.
but that's the one door is protecting it. And as long as that door is closed, then you don't need to worry about, locking your car door or your windows or, where you leave the keys.
Right.
You don't need to worry about, putting a chain around your bicycle and stuff. So in those cases that you're really reliant on that perimeter security, there might be a key, you might have a wireless sensor, you might have a security guard, if you're maybe Jay Leno and you've got lots of cars, you want to protect your garage because you've got a lot of valuables in that garage. So when you think about it, that's what on-premise traditional security is really focused around, those entry points. Mm-hmm. And when you're inside, people can open the doors, can get in. You're less worried about the controls inside, but it's that door you're protecting.
Right.
And when you move to cloud, it's like taking all of your cars and your bicycles and motorbikes or whatever from your garage and your valuables, and then driving it across the street and putting it in a shared parking lot. Mm-hmm. Now all your cars and everything else is with everyone else's cars. And now you've got to think about, well, okay, I'm now dependent on the security controls that parking garage is actually sharing and providing. And now you start needing to think, well, I need to lock the car doors. I need to make sure the windows are closed, the boot and the trunk of the car is closed. I might need to think about additional security controls and access. So you now have to think about each of those devices and components and infrastructure pieces themselves. And that's where you start getting into that shared garage. And then you start thinking about, well, maybe I don't own the car. Maybe I'm using a service like an Uber. Mm-hmm, and now it's more about you then thinking about the data and how that data gets in and moved around. So this is kind of where I have those metaphors that really kind of transition into really, you need to think about, as you move to cloud and you move to SaaS, you need to think about security from a very different perspective. You need to think about it from the actual, the device or the system or the operating environment, or the infrastructure that you're providing, the access controls becomes so, kind of critical, and encryption as well. So those things all, it's no longer about that traditional firewall perimeter and the security guard. It's all about basically making sure it's about access, authentication, security controls, about, identities, and the encryption of the data itself and how it flows. And that changes the way you need to look at it from that perspective.
Yeah, I love that car analogy and the garage analogy, because like the first thing that popped to my mind was, as you were talking about it, was, if my car's in my garage and I need to work on it, I can take things out. I can leave them over here. Like I can, as long as that garage door is closed, I mean, as long as the engine's not running, I can do what I need to do, and I can take things out and I don't have to worry. But if I was going into a shared space, now I have to be way more conscious of what am I taking out of my car, as I work on it. It's from that developer perspective. And so making sure that, there's some way for us to do that work in the shared garage without worrying about who, maybe it's more like, rather than a shared garage, you're bringing your car to the racetrack. So you don't want, competitors to know what tweaks you're making to your engine. How do you do this in a secure way so that others can't see what you're doing, versus when you're working on it in your, the private garage.
Yeah. It's that point where the configuration becomes important. I remember, I think I mentioned before, I was a large bank in Scotland, or where they said to me the worst worry that they have is that when changing security is not a problem. It's when the moment that you've taken the security off and there's no security in place to putting the next security element in place, is that gap is basically the risk. Mm-hmm. It's not whether you've got security product A or B, it's the gap that there's nothing on the door. And that was the biggest area. In cloud, that becomes such more demanding, because you can't, in the garage, as long as you mentioned, you can take the car door off and not still, you've got some security controlling, but in the cloud, you can take that car door off. As you say, other people can see inside.
Right, exactly.
Which you might not want them to see, especially if it's public access. Another big thing in the report as well, which I want to highlight, is that there was an indication as well that dwell time is significantly decreasing. It's hugely decreasing the dwell time, which is the time in order to detect breaches. In many cases, for most organizations, is getting into towards days, where it used to be months. It used to be like almost a year before you determine a breach. And one of the things that indicated that what was helping that was more managed security service providers, more companies who are providing more specialized skills and becoming more of a specialized kind of extension to companies. and they are running tools that they specialize in and now able to detect the breaches and incidents much earlier. So,
well, right. And they also have
and
the scale factor that works in their favor, right?
correct.
Because they can, if you're a small company, you can't afford that team, you can't afford all the tools and all the technology that they're using. And right, it's the typical like, hey, let's hire a specialist who now they can spread, they can do it all right and they can afford it because they're doing this for, they sort of get that economy of scale.
Yeah, absolutely. And for me, that was a major thing that it really shows that organizations, you can't do everything yourselves. You have to work with, best practices out there, get the right skills. You don't have to have them internally, permanently on your staff, depending on the size of the organization, the business, if you do, of course.
Right.
But, if you're a small business or medium business that, you can't afford that, or it's not your focus, absolutely, working with a managed service provider on those areas will definitely help. Especially, reduce that dwell time, which is significant because it's the dwell time, which can be days can be millions for companies in regards to the impact costs from data breaches. So for me, that was a significant one that was very, very interesting. Another piece of note as well, which wasn't in the report, because of course this report's always a lagging indicator. So it was something that you're always kind of, you're seeing the results, but there's always a period of time where it doesn't include certain impacts. And the one thing for me, I think, is ransomware is evolving again. And this is, for me, is probably the biggest thing that organizations should be worried about or fearful of is ransomware. And the techniques now that ransomware is not just about, poisoning or making data unavailable. What it's also doing is doxing as well. It's stealing the data and threatening to disclose it. And we've seen, the recent incident with the law firm, which is now starting to also from governments and presidents and other things that are now being disclosed from data, that we have to really look at. Ransomware is starting to evolve, and it might be that it's also not just making the data available. And if you don't pay the ransom and you do have a good backup, that's not what you need to worry about now. You need to worry about is that data got something sensitive in the content, and therefore whoever the criminal is now threatening to disclose it, make it publicly available unless you pay the ransom.
Right.
So I think that's something that the report doesn't. It does indicate that it doesn't include that, and that there's new evolutions in and changes in ransomware, and so it does highlight that. But for me, absolutely, that was one thing that I did note is that ransomware
the threat of extortion.
Evolving.
It's not ransomware, right? It's extortionware now. It's like because they're
correct.
Yeah, that's an interesting trend. I don't know that I was aware that it was really picking up that much. So I appreciate you.
Yeah, there's been cases. I think we looked through. There's been a number of cases already this year. High profile cases that have been victims of this, from currency exchanges to power stations, and now of course law firms. Right. And they all have, serious implications. What else comes out of that? We remember the Panama Papers years ago. What that disclosed.
Right.
So law firms definitely are a major target, and also from a security perspective, and their setup is very decentralized because you've got lots of lawyers working many different things. So they become definitely a prime target from criminals, and definitely something that they should be looking, because they deal with a lot of significant types of sensitive data.
Yeah, and I think also when I think about law firms, at least in the U.S., there's the really large ones that come to mind and the decentralized and so on and so forth. But there's also plenty of small law firm practices that do have to rely on how are they going to secure their stuff, and IT isn't really a line item budget that they want to put a lot into. It's not and so again, it's that what's going to force them to put more money into it is not just, oh, now we have the backup, so if we get ransomware, like it's not that big a deal, we can restore from backup. Now it's like, oh no, we have to, it's again, there's this new financial threat that's going to cause them to have to evolve yet again to deal with no, we don't even want to have to deal with the chance of this getting out.
It's
so
bi-directional eventually. Eventually what happens is that it's bi-directional. Eventually now choosing your law firm, because you want to make sure that they actually have the right security in place.
Right.
So you start auditing the law firm. So that, of course, introduces multiple law firms, which is probably not a good thing. Another thing in the report as well, which for me is that, a lot of the techniques that are used, what seems to be, definitely, continuous on the increase in the report, as well as, credential stuffing, is another major. I always hear time and time again about how sophisticated breaches are, and how they are maybe nation state backed. They've been doing this for a long time, and I find that probably sophisticated is sometimes overrated and overstated, which ends up sometimes being a simple one click on a phishing email or a credential stuffing, or somebody's used the same password in multiple systems. And definitely, the report does indicate, credential stuffing is on the increase, and that most of the types of techniques, which tends to happen in the number of steps is usually it's around 4 steps. 2 to 4 steps is the optimum number of steps that a attacker uses to gain full access.
Wow.
Between 2 to 4 steps,
right.
And that for me is like, and even when I know, probably one thing that's missing in the report side of things is there's a couple of things that's missing from my perspective. One is they don't talk enough about the success and positive side. I think that's something they should really highlight better. Is this report is an indicator of positive direction and trend. There is successes out there, and we have to highlight that better. I think because otherwise people are feeling the doom and gloom side of things. But what's missing in this report is and this is probably the most difficult thing you can't get, is the passive side of things is done in a incident or data breach, is the work that the attacker did prior to gaining access, or the active attack.
Oh, that's interesting.
And actually, my experience when you're doing penetration testing and ethical hacking, that's a large amount of the time. It's 80-90% of your time is actually doing passive recon. Is that you're learning about the target, you're looking at the resume sites, you're looking at archived web pages, you're looking at supply chain, you're looking at all the details about the organization, and that's always missing. So you don't know how much. If in this report it's from the knock on the door, that first time they knocked on the door, or the first time you saw an IP address, and it's the number of steps at that point. So we are missing the passive piece. And that is always a large portion of the preparation and planning and attack path that goes into a lot of criminals' work. But yeah, once that knock on the door comes, it's between 2 to 4 steps that they gain access to what they need. Some, of course, go further and beyond that. But that's an indicator that, in many cases that it's the security controls in place, and with credential stuffing and stolen passwords still continuing to be a primary technique. We really have to look, and that's one of my points, even the cloud side, where it was a large portion of cloud breaches were, contributor or attribution of those areas, that we really need to consider, definitely better security techniques at, at the front door, and to make those steps, that if your data is only 2 steps away from right. from the front door, we're probably, the principle of least privilege is probably an area that needs to be probably raised and enforced again. And that's something that our listeners can listen on another podcast when we go into that in detail.
Yeah, definitely. But did the report get into things about because I already admitted I didn't read the full report. What techniques are really what's working, or why we think things are going in the direction they are? Because I think when I think about things, right, I want to know. I want to take advantage of other people's lessons, and I want to be able to say okay, well, this seems to be working, so let's continue down this path.
Yeah, I think one of the things in the report itself, just kind of, so the techniques that were actually the top techniques. Of course, and one of the things that organized crime is still your largest attacker, bind it, and by a large amount. So organized crime is definitely the one that we need to be worrying about. Errors and misconfigurations, or one that was on the increase. The delivery method continues to be the same delivery method, where it's using things like so the 3 top techniques was credential theft and phishing was the top 2 techniques that was used.
What I meant by what's working is not so much what's working for the criminals as much as what's working for the people on the other side of it. What techniques can we be using? Yeah, the defender side of it. What do they get into the details there? Because I know from the report, I do know that yes, they went into the various details of what successful that way.
So The best things is that is making sure that a password is not the only security control. I mean, this is a fundamental, and getting it to make sure that we use passphrases longer, better protected, and using multi-factor authentication in addition to passwords, especially for things like web applications, using cloud, access controls. Is that it should be, if you move to just basically being more than just a password and having things like multi-factor authentication, doing, especially for privileged access, for things like remote desktop or access to databases where you have access to more sensitive infrastructure, then you have, of course, privileged access becomes fundamental in that as well. So the segregation of the access controls. Those are, bringing in MSSP providers in order to help you basically provide much more level of expertise, especially detection, intrusion prevention, all of those areas, and maybe even shared management of some aspects. And good cybersecurity awareness training, having your employees more up to date, and then having more controls and checks on when you're doing basically sensitive configuration changes of infrastructure, database, and application rollouts. So if you really get into having a very consistent process at your deployment, installation, configuration, that you use more than just a password to protect those infrastructure with things like multi-factor and privileged access, and your employees are more aware, more responsibility, those are the things that work. That's what reduces the risk. It's not going to completely, fix everything, but you will actually see a significant improvement. And the other side of things as well, what's important is that's the preventive side. You still need to invest in instant response. I get into the firefighter side, is that you need to make sure that when it does happen, that you're able to get, again, that dwell time is significant. The reducing of that dwell time, the more you can respond quickly, the more you can get back up, and more you can eradicate the attackers, the less cost it is for the organization. So those are the things, phishing and pretexting is on the increase through social sites, web applications that are target. Don't let it be just a username and password protecting it. Cloud is definitely from credential stuffing. So we need to make sure the top industries that are still targeted is professional industries are still largely up there. Public entities, information technology companies, and finance. And manufacturing, education, healthcare, those are all the top primary targets, and they're both consistent in both the incidents and breaches side, because they do separate them into incident breaches. Another thing that ransomware was moved from incidents to becoming breaches in the future because of that technique change of stealing data. That changes it from just being an incident to being also a data breach. Right. And then another major area was the motivation for me. This is always a primary thing, is that the motivation continues to be financial. The large portion of all of these incidents is money. Is money what ultimately determines whether it being ransomware, whether it being stolen IP, intellectual property, extortion, or copying other people's technologies or finding ways of espionage. Purely, a lot of it ends up being motivation, money. And also, the report get into, finally, I'll get into the last piece, is that it does say that size of the organization doesn't really matter. All organizations are target no matter what size they are, and being a large organization or small organization doesn't mean that attackers won't target you. And the report did get into recommendations into being the CIS, Center of Internet Security. The top 20 controls is basically your best friend at mitigating the risks. So getting into the CIS top 20 controls, if you're able to have those as part of your IT security strategy, it will actually help you address those risks. So those are the things that fundamentally, summarizing the report up, is that there's things that we can do. There's things, that are becoming much more of a popular technique from attackers, but we are heading the right direction. We just need to continue and going to, getting the board support, getting the investment along CISOs to do what they need to be doing. Having great CISOs like yourself, being able to get the support, being able to make action, being able to, get the budget, is all things that will actually help our organizations at least reduce the risk enough in order to make security work for us.
Yep. And I appreciate, on our board, security is an important piece of that as well. We have, our board members care a lot about security as well. So it starts there, and it makes it a lot easier. It's not a confrontational conversation. It's that makes a lot of sense. That seems like the right thing to do type of conversation. which is
Absolutely.
definitely
And
helpful.
security, it's not a bottom up approach, and it's not a top down approach.
Right.
It's everyone's responsibility.
Absolutely.
And that's how it works. There's no triangle here in security.
Right.
It might be. I'm probably conflicting a lot of people's terms on the CIA triad and all these other types. Everyone likes a triangle. But cybersecurity is more like a square.
Right.
It's everyone's responsibility. We're all accountable. It's a bottom-up approach. It's a top-down approach. We all are going to, if we work together, and not just from basically single organizations, but as a community, and we, make sure there's less places for cyber criminals to hide.
Mm-hmm.
And that means that it's not just about organizations and security researchers and hackers all working together, but it's also about governments as well.
Mm-hmm.
That's important, is that we have this is a global initiative, a global perspective. And this report definitely is, it's definitely a global view.
Yeah, definitely.
So my last thing before we finish up today is, for the Verizon team, awesome report as usual. Keep up the great work. Do read my blog if you see it out there. It will be a summarizing of the discussions we've just had. And this is a time for break out the barbecues, have a good beers, time to celebrate, and let's continue the path we're on. Let's make sure we're reducing the risks. So
yeah, definitely.
Awesome. Keep up.
Awesome.
The work.
Always a pleasure to talk to you, Joe. I look forward to
likewise.
these every time. All right. Take it easy.
Take
Next
care,
time.
everyone. Stay safe. Thanks.